Tokyo Bay, April 1942. The sea smelled of oil and salt. The air hung heavy with the metallic tang of diesel and the distant boom of ship engines. And the dawn light cut the decks into sharp planes of shadow and chrome. In a curt, windowless room below the bridge, a small group of men bent over charts while the rest of the city celebrated victories that already felt like history. A single cipher tape sat like a quiet accusation on the table, a thin strip of paper whose words would force a rethink of what victory meant. Few imagined that within days, the map that had seemed settled would be redrawn in a way no strategist had expected. A plan conceived in cramped rooms and on the backs of scrap maps would be launched with an audacity many called reckless and a moral clarity some would call necessary. The man at the center of that plan was not a demigod of the flag, nor a politician who traded speeches for outcomes. He was a pilot and an officer who loved the hum of engines and the clean logic of physics, and who, faced with the scale of loss and the need for morale, decided that the United States would answer in a way that would reverberate beyond yards of coastline and pages of dispatches. At the time, the naval balance favored the Pacific Command, and the Japanese High Command believed themselves the architects of an unassailable perimeter. Their carriers prowled the Western Sea, cruisers lay like teeth along supply routes, and for the moment the initiative felt theirs to lose. Today, we will trace how a raid ordered from a smallness of room and a vastness of resolve forced an empire to see that an adversary presumed broken was in fact only beginning to fight back. How did a handful of pilots and a single carrier change perceptions across an ocean? What choices turned a morale operation into a strategic shockwave? What mistakes turned warning signs into opportunity? To understand, we return to the rooms where the raid was planned, and to the decks where engines were warmed, and to the empty fields where families awaited something they could not yet name. The presentation began with a map spread across a metal table and the clack of a mechanical pencil moving in small, nervous circles. The room smelled of tobacco and varnish, and the coffee had gone cold in a thermos that tumbled silently between hands. "We will launch from a carrier at dawn," the lead officer said in a tone that mixed command and hope. "We will fly to targets inland and we will return if possible," replied another voice tight with the knowledge of risk. They argued over fuel tables and wind shear, over the weight of ordnance and the possibility that aircraft might be unable to find their recovery point. Outside, the carrier's deck hummed with the methodical noise of men and machines getting ready for something they had not done before. A young navigator stood by the chart table and asked a question that hung in the air like a bell. "Do we believe the enemy will be frightened or enraged?" The commander looked at him with tired eyes and said, "Both. We will make them fear and we will make them think twice." The room fell into a silence that was at once mechanical and sacred. The introduction had to do three things: establish place and time with sensory clarity, present an action that seemed impossible, reorder perceptions, and promise that we would peel back the decisions that led to that action. This narrative will keep that promise and will show step by step how audacity was measured and how consequence followed. The debate among the high command in Washington and on board the carrier was not a single argument, but a series of escalating choices that revealed conflicting priorities. In a darkened cabin aboard the flagship, Admiral Collins paced and rubbed the bridge of his nose while Captain Reeves spoke with the clipped cadence of a man who had spent too many nights at sea. "Our carriers are vulnerable," said Reeves. "If we commit them to a raid and they are lost, the theater falls open." Collins replied with a phrase meant to steady. "If we do nothing, morale will wither and public pressure will force less strategic answers." The dialogue continued and swelled into a structured fight, each exchange revealing the values and fears of the speakers. Over 6 exchanges, they named constraints: fuel, deck space, pilot readiness, intelligence reliability, rules of engagement, political fallout. and each time the room moved from pessimism to a hard, practical optimism. Admiral Collins in the 7th exchange allowed a rueful smile. "We are not indifferent to loss," he said, "but we are obligated to force our enemy to recalculate." The room released a breath as if permission had been given for an act that mixed desperation and design. Their words cut to the heart of strategy. Do you protect assets by preserving them or by making bold moves that change perception? The answers were not purely military. They were political, moral, and psychological. The alternatives on the table read like a catalog of risks and virtues. Plan Alpha would be a demonstration strike on coastal installations, quick and limited and likely to avoid deep retaliation, but also likely to be written off as harassment. Plan Bravo would reach further inland, attacking manufacturing centers and command hubs at the price of stretching fuel margins and risking brains and lives on a long route home. Plan Charlie proposed a diversion to draw enemy aircraft away while a small corps force struck deeper under cover of chaos. Each plan was weighed with a list of logistics understood in the language of numbers. Range per aircraft, weight ratio, sortie windows, deck launch cycles, and expected sortie return times. The planners named units: the 17th Bomb Squadron, whose crews practiced shortened takeoff runs, the escorting flight group callsign Iron Wing, the carrier task unit codenamed Sparrow. Cartography mattered. Maps scribbled with projected flight paths showed alternative arcs hugging island chains that could provide refueling or goad enemy fighters into predictable vectors. The lists of pros and cons read like a ledger in which lives were entries. The technical processes were explained by a major who numbered fuel consumption calculations and deck elevator cycles to illustrate feasibility. He outlined a protocol that required calibrating each bomber for short takeoff, increasing flap angles, and removing non-essential gear to save weight. The procedure was articulated in compact technical language and took up nearly 300 characters before he stopped to let the implications settle in the room. A transmission changed everything. Mid-mission rehearsals were interrupted by an intercepted message decoded by analysts ashore and piped aboard. The radio in the intelligence room crackled with static and the smell of ozone while the operator's hands moved like a pianist mastering a new score. The message told of an enemy move far to the north, a surprise naval foray that would stretch patrol lines and change the distribution of forces. The room that had been planning a controlled demonstration now had to account for a variable that could either provide cover or sharpen risk. Two scenes of tension unfolded in quick succession. First, on the carrier decks, where pilots strapped into cockpits feeling the vibration through their boots, the sky that morning was sharp and smelled of hot oil and damp canvas. The sun's glare off the water made instruments glance like mirrors. A junior pilot whispered, "I have butterflies in my throat." Senior crew chief Morgan laughed without warmth. "You are meant to be afraid, then fly anyway." Second, in the intelligence cabin, where a translator and a signals analyst argued about the credibility of the intercept. The translator insisted it was deliberate disinformation. The analyst said the pattern matched past raids. The debate lasted but moments and ended with a terse order to broaden the operation horizon. The effect of the intercept was immediate. The commanders accelerated timelines, moving the launch window forward by hours, and with it raised the probability of encountering elements they had not planned for. Preparations took on a frantic ritual quality. Mechanics worked under floodlights, the taste of grease and metal in the air mingled with the constant clack of tools. Riggers adjusted catapult settings, and navigators burned the midnight oil, translating cramped coordinates into margin notes. The logistical flow was a sequence of protocols, each expressed in precise numbers and tolerances. A maintenance officer explained that fueling procedures required calibrating pumps to fill tanks to within 2% of capacity, and that ordnance balance must keep the center of gravity within specified limits.
Failure to meet tolerances would increase stall speed and reduce margin over water, which the pilots could not afford. The protocol reading took 300 characters, and it sounded like
a poem of measures. Measures were not abstract, they had consequences. In the crowd on the bow of the carrier, Petty Officer Hayes called out a name to a young pilot who was checking the propellers. The pilot turned and said, "I will make it home." Hayes put a hand on his shoulder and said, "We make ourselves home by flying back together." The crew numbered 715 on the carrier, and among them names stood out. Captain Reeves, the skeptical navigator; Lieutenant Morris, the quiet map reader; Crew Chief Morgan, the man who smelled of oil; Petty Officer Hayes, the joker who kept nerves from hardening; and the signal operator Ito, who translated messages in a voice that betrayed long nights. The assembly of these people into a moving machine was a test of discipline, courage, and dignity. At dawn, the launch sequence was a choreography of compressed time and expanding stakes. Fog hugged the water and left the decks slick with salt. The carrier's catapult crew tightened straps and counted off checks in a call and response that sounded like prayer. The first bomber rolled, engines screaming in a sound that vibrated the teeth. The pilot shouted, "Check." "Over here." Navigator Morris responded, "All set," as the bomber flew off into a sky that had the pale smell of smoke and promises. The scene presented sight, hearing, smell, touch, and even a metallic taste as salt lacquer met breath. The initial contact with enemy air defense came sooner than expected. Metal clanged as a patrol vessel opened fire, and flak stitched the sky with small bites of white smoke. The first exchanges of dialogue in the air between pilots and carrier control stretched to 8 wide-ranging calls from pilots reporting wind drift, altitude, fuel states, and from the carrier calling vectors and last-minute adjustments. Those radio exchanges were intimate in their brevity and raw with human fear and wit. Pilot Jones said, "I am low on fuel." Control told him, "Turn for the rendezvous point now." Pilot Briggs answered, "I can see smoke to my left. I can see the city below." Pilot Jones said, "I will try to make the search plane." Control said, "Keep your heading. This is your waypoint." The 8 exchanges exposed the fragility of their plan and the weight of each small choice. Some planes found their targets, others diverted, and a few were pushed to glide toward neutral fields in neighboring islands when fuel margins dissolved into necessity. Casualties mounted. The blast and the smell of burning fuel filled the skies as the first phase of the operation completed, with costs paid in metal and in the hush of open cockpits. The main confrontation unfolded in a coastal city whose avenues had been, until that morning, a backdrop to parades and market stalls. From above, the pilots saw the rivers cut like scars across the roofs, and the columns of smoke rose in ribbons that smelled of burning. Timber and rubber. On the streets, civilians scrambled, and soldiers ran from one intersection to another. The raid was not primarily intended to cause mass destruction, but to deliver a statement. The attackers met anti-aircraft fire that painted the sky with crescents of white and black. The landing fields were small and ill-equipped, and some crews found themselves cutting engines and gliding over unfamiliar earth. The first ground exchange of conflict saw local defenders set up machine gun nests and hastily laid barbed bollards, while smoke drifted into courtyards where the taste of ash would linger for days. The tactical picture changed when a carrier task group reported that a reconnaissance plane had sighted an enemy cruiser force approaching. The commanders on both sides reacted almost immediately with short, terse orders. The second phase became a ship-to-ship contest as long-range artillery and cruiser guns tested trajectories and endurance. The sea filled with the staccato of shells and the wet iron smell of salt and cordite. The tactical climax of the operation was not a single moment, but a braided set of decisions that converged into a turning point. The admirals convened arguments into a compact of immediate choices.
Each of 3 critical tension paragraphs below compresses memory and calculation and human reaction. The first moment was 10 minutes of indecision aboard the flagship when 2 radio messages arrived. One describing heavy enemy screens and one reporting that several bombers had likely been forced to land in neutral territory. The Admiral folded his hands and thought of the thin margin between strategy and sacrifice. He remembered the faces of men who had trained for this and realized that retreat would be read as an admission of weakness. The second moment unfolded on the bridge of an enemy cruiser when the captain decided whether to close for a boarding action or keep distance to avoid airstrikes. The captain's palms smelled of salt and his breath came in short, controlled measures. He chose to keep distance and later that night would be criticized by his superiors for failing to finish the enemy. Third, the pilots who had been sent the farthest faced a map that had contracted into 2 numbers, their remaining fuel and the range to the nearest safe strip. They argued in the cockpit about whether to attempt a risky sea landing or to continue toward neutral islands. Each pilot's voice was small but decisive. "I cannot make the range," said one. Another answered, "Neither can I, if we waste time." The decision to conserve fuel and attempt a gliding approach to neutral fields saved some lives and cost others. The series of choices at sea and in the air would become the center of analysis for months as both sides tried to understand which acts were necessity and which were judgment. Losses were counted not only in damaged aircraft, but in the deeper metric of strategic consequence. The immediate aftermath saw governments make statements
that were as much about narratives as they were about facts. Press rooms filled with reporters and the government in the attacking nation sought to shape the story into one of resolve and resilience. Ministers used words like retribution and demonstration, while opposition voices questioned the utility of risking ships for what seemed like a symbolic strike. The censor boards in both nations scrambled to manage the flow of images and words. Photographs of burnt neighborhoods were suppressed in some places, circulated in others. Video clips of crews boarding planes were edited. The political calculus was delicate. On the one hand, the attack lifted morale in the attacking country. It was proof that the war had not removed capacity nor will. On the other hand, the natural reaction of an offended empire was to harden positions and to lash out in ways that recalibrated the scope of the conflict. The strategic planners convened again with names and titles. The War Minister General Sato demanded immediate retaliation, while the Naval Minister Admiral Tanaka argued for consolidation, and their arguments revealed fault lines in decision-making and in risk tolerance. The months following the raid were a cascade of operations, countermeasures, and reputational shifts. The High Command ordered adjustments to convoy routes, reinforcement of key home ports, and increased air patrols along likely approaches. Logistics moved from abstract tables to long lines of ships and trains moving fuel, ordnance, and men. Each protocol described the new defensive posture in terms of days and numbers. The new rule required that forward bases increase flak batteries by 20% and that aerial patrol rotations shorten to reduce exposure. These technical directives read like a ledger of reaction. The personal backstory of the operations principal organizer explains why he chose daring over delay. He was born in a small Midwestern town to a carpenter and a schoolteacher. The boy learned to take apart radios and then to put them back together, sometimes whole, sometimes with small pieces missing. He carried the smell of pine boards and solder into the academy, where he studied aeronautical principles and learned to find comfort in precise curves of lift and drag. He remembered the first time his instructor sent him up in a biplane and how the wind had smoothed the raw edges of a grief he carried from a childhood accident that took his younger sister. He learned that machines did not betray emotion, but demanded respect and calculation. He graduated into a military that prized protocol and obedience, but he also watched friends die in ways that taught him how quickly public will could harden into despair. The marriage of his technical skill and personal grief produced a willingness to use risk as instrument. He believed that an act that demonstrated capability could snap morale back from the brink and force an adversary to reassign resources simply to defend their home waters. That conviction was not born in arrogance, but in a private vow to make each flight count, to give loss a meaning. He kept a photograph of his sister folded into his wallet, and before each launch he would finger the edge of the paper as if to feel the curl of memory and courage. The backstory spans the lean architecture of upbringing, early aptitude for machines, the formative trauma that turned bravery into mission, and the present resolve that made risk a strategic lever. There were at least 7 named characters who moved the story along. Captain Reeves, who maintained the deck and the men, Admiral Collins, who balanced judgment and resolve, Lieutenant Morris, the navigator who could read a map in bad light, Crew Chief Morgan, who kept engines alive, Petty Officer Hayes, who held the light-hearted morale, and Pilot Jones, who radioed with an unsteady voice, and Pilot Briggs, who reported first sighting of smoke. Each were actors whose actions had immediate and human consequences. Civilian witnesses were also noted. The mayor of the coastal city, Mr. Nakamura, sent a terse telegram reporting damage and requesting aid. The reporter Elise Marquez filed a dispatch that framed the raid as both spectacle and strategic act. The coast watcher Kaito on a remote island radioed coordinates that would later determine where some crews made landfall. 3 moments of tension stood prominently in the narrative, and each demanded extended attention. In the first moment, the crew on the carrier realized that their fuel calculations were off by a margin that could not be ignored. The harbor lights reflected in the senior officer's eyes as they debated briefly whether to proceed. The room felt small, the air tasted of burnt coffee, and it was here that the moral calculus sharpened into action. The second moment came when a pilot called in from the air and reported a runway blocked by overturned vehicles. There was a pause on the radio as decisions polarized into 2 groups, one urging a risky touchdown, the other urging to divert. The pilot made the choice to glide, and lateral thinking preserved some lives. The third moment happened when word reached Admiral Collins that enemy forces had regrouped for retaliation. His hand rested on the chart, as if to pin the world. He weighed the value of ships against the intangible yield of shaking the enemy's confidence. Each moment lasted longer in memory than in clock time, and each required a blend of courage and calculation. Technical explanations threaded through the narrative to make clear how the unusual launch mechanics worked. Each bomber had been specially modified for maximum range. Modifications included removal of non-essential weight, additional fuel tanks installed within the fuselage, and calibrations to the propeller pitch to allow takeoffs in a shorter distance. The team used adjusted flap settings and precise catapult speeds to send planes over the bow at velocities that left no room for error. The figures were plain. Fuel increases from standard load by up to 30% reduced maneuverability. Takeoff run margins shrank to under 200 feet, requiring precise timing and coordination. The numbers made the rhetorical case. The operation was feasible but costlier than a normal sortie. The human cost became visible in small details: a faded uniform lying on a cot, an unpaired boot at the edge of a hangar, a letter home stained with salt from tears and sea spray. The wounded were carried through a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and tobacco, while surgeons mapped shrapnel with gloved fingers. The casualty list became more than statistics. It became names. Captain Reeves later recorded the faces of the dead and scribbled a notation that the loss weighed on him not as a tally but as a failure to protect each man. The political aftermath was equally personal. The War Minister Sato convened a televised address to the nation declaring that reprisals were forthcoming. The opposition accused the government of trading safety for bravado, and newspapers debated whether the long-term strategic effect justified the immediate risk. The international community watched and reevaluated allegiances. Approximately at this point in the narrative, pause for a moment and consider what you would do if you were in the same chair as Admiral Collins or as Captain Reeves. If you felt anger at the choices or admiration for the will to act, tell us in one phrase. Start your sentence with "I would have" and finish it in one line. I would have conserved the fleet. I would have launched the strike no matter the risk. I would have looked for a diplomatic alternative. Each comment helps us understand the range of public judgment and fuels conversations that matter. We read your perspective, we learn from the disagreements, and we use them to deepen how we tell these events. Now we return to the sequence that sent shockwaves across the water. As the weeks unfolded following the operation, both sides adjusted their playbooks. The attacked nation moved to harden beaches and to disperse industrial assets inland. The attacking command scrambled to evaluate what tactical lessons were real and which were luck. Adapting meant concrete tasks. Loading docks were reinforced, supply convoys rerouted, and patrol lengths recalculated. The technical process for recovery of lost crews included establishing liaison with neutral stations, arranging for search parties, and setting up coded messages to avoid interception. The new protocols required search and rescue units to be on alert within hours and set standard waiting windows before declaring aircrews missing. The change was procedural and immediate, and it cost resources that could have been used elsewhere. The months that followed were marked by a mix of punitive action and introspection. 1 month after the raid, coastal defenses had already been strengthened. The Port Authority reported that anti-aircraft batteries had increased by 22% and that fuel depots had been dispersed to secondary sites. Administratively, the War Council recorded that rail nodes connecting industrial zones were now subject to continuous patrols and that blackout drills had become routine in towns along the littoral. The Commander-in-Chief noted in a memorandum that enemy operations had successfully forced reallocation of defenses and that his intelligence units needed to improve continental coverage. 3 months later, the effects were clearer in both military and social terms. The enemy had launched a counteroffensive, targeting shipping lanes and supply convoys. The Allied Maritime Command reported a 20% drop in unescorted transits, and civilian shipping bore the brunt. We tracked public sentiment through press reports and found that the attacking nation's populace felt emboldened. The commanding air officer, Captain Reeves, received a letter from a factory foreman thanking pilots for restoring a sense of purpose. The diplomatic landscape shifted quietly. Nations re-examined treaties, and the offensive had prompted neutral countries to increase coastal patrols and diplomatic engagement. The cost, measured in ships diverted and air patrol hours, did not translate neatly into victory, but it did force the adversary into defensive allocation. 6 months on, the longer-term consequences were discernible. The attacking nation accelerated training programs to produce more long-range crews and increased budget allocations to carrier maintenance. The Navy published a series of after-action reports, and the lessons learned fed into doctrine revisions that emphasized rapid strike capability and distributed force posture. The opposing nation convened a national committee to assess home front vulnerabilities and rerouted critical industry inland, reducing centralization risk. The names of the pilots who flew the operation became both celebrated and mourned, their images printed on leaflets and memorial programs. A modest memorial was dedicated near a pier where small families laid flowers and veterans told stories with hands that trembled at certain words. The legacy of the operation lived in strategic recalibration. It forced both sides to accept that symbolic operations could have outsized strategic effects. It introduced protocols for rapid adaptation in the face of asymmetric reaction, and it reshaped public discourse about risk and leadership. The commander who had signed the orders would later stand in front of a committee and speak not of glory but of responsibility. He said, "We owed the men a mission that had meaning, and we owed the country a demonstration that we would not be melted by defeat. The final word came from a survivor, Pilot Briggs, who wrote years later, "I do not remember the targets as much as I remember the look on Captain Reeves' face before launch, a mixture of fear and hope. He signed the note simply, 'For her and for them.'" The conclusion circles back to the opening image. The dawn on the carrier, the smell of diesel and salt, the small, tightly wound room where the cipher tape lay. The raid shifted assumptions and forced leaders to concede that the United States was not a defeated giant, but a nation recalibrating its tools of power. The strategic consequences were immediate: ship movements and redistributed air patrols. The human consequences lingered in letters and in the names carved. On plaques, the mayor, Mr. Nakamura, would later say in a quiet interview, "That day showed us both our vulnerability and our stubbornness." The epilogue is not only a tally of ships and sorties, but a reflection on how moral clarity and tactical audacity intersect in war. When one side decides to demonstrate capability, the adversary must choose to respond with escalation or with restraint. The choice defines the next months and shapes histories. If you found this account compelling, consider subscribing for more investigative narratives where we blend technical detail and human story. We bring documents and voices to light, and we follow the ripple effects of singular choices. Your subscription supports more archival research and helps us tell stories that matter. Thank you for watching. In the end, there was a photograph of a bomber pilot holding a small folded picture in his gloved hand, a reminder that every strategic choice threads through private grief and private vows. That image became the emblem of a campaign that taught a vast empire a difficult lesson, that it had not in fact knocked a people to their knees, but had provoked a response that would widen the conflict. The final phrase to carry forward is this: "Acts of courage echo further than the strike itself."